Hi, guys. Welcome to another Monday night study. We have been going through looking at books of the Bible, the canon, those kind of things. So let me just kind of remind you as we start. Here's our BibleFacts.org site, and this is our current study that we're doing. And then down here we have our Bible Facts Network, and that's basically kind of new. So we're trying to put everything there so we can have a good place to study that is safe from all the confusion, all the censorship, and all that stuff. So let's bring that up. And in here, what we've been doing is studying the canons of Scripture. And the reason we're doing this is just kind of set the stage, because some people might say, well, you're trying to add to the canon. No, we're not. So we want to define a canon. We want to follow different things like that. So what we have over the past 3 weeks, we've looked at these. And we basically looked at the study, and you can click on these if you're a member of the site and look at them. But the Old Testament, what we basically said was that the Old Testament was put together by prophets. So the concept that Moses did things to prove he was a prophet, and he wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Joshua wrote Joshua, and we see things that going on in the book of Joshua, like the sun standing still, a whole bunch of things like that. So basically, whether the person writing the book or not was a prophet, and I think probably almost all of them were, the prophets put them together. And that's the concept we want to say. And so when we're studying the Old Testament, we found that the Ezra Apocalypse mentions that the canon was closed by Ezra under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to what they consider to be 24 books. And that's confusing to some, but we were just saying how we group them differently. They have one book of the 12 minor prophets. We have 12 separate books of each one of the prophets. So we divide them differently. But we've got these 39 books of the Old Testament, and that's where it was sealed. That doesn't mean that there can't be a prophetic writing, 100% accurate history, accurate theology, history of theologians, a history of heretics, and that wouldn't be important for some of us to know, but it's not to be added to the canon. So that's the really important part. And we saw in that study that that's basically how the King James 1611 was put together. The compromise was between Anglicans and Protestants and Catholics. The Catholics wanted the Apocrypha in the Old Testament, and that's the way it was written in the Septuagint, or some of the Septuagints. Septuagint itself is an interesting study, which we didn't get to for that because we're just trying to figure out books in the canon. But basically, the compromise was to take what the Roman Catholics wanted in the Bible that was outside the Old Testament canon and put them in the center in between the Old and the New Testaments, because you wouldn't want to add those to the New Testament either. And in so doing, the compromise was the Roman Catholic Apocrypha put in the center, but also the Anglican Apocrypha, so that Ezra Apocalypse was added, which explains why it should be divided that way, and other interesting prophecies in it. So that's how we got to that. Then we looked at the New Testament, and the same kind of an idea that the prophets put that together. You start with the teachings of the disciples of the Messiah himself. So you start with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you go on up. We talked about how Paul was actually prophesied in the Dead Sea Scrolls, so obviously a prophet in that sense. And of course, the book ends with John writing a vision that he saw from God, dictated basically by Jesus Christ. So we end with a prophetic book. And so at that point, the canon is closed. And we speculated that, maybe in the kingdom age, those two witnesses maybe, or someone else might write books to say, this is how actually it took place. So maybe there'll be other things too. But in either case, it wouldn't be added to the New Testament or added to the Old Testament. So the concept of different canons is what we want to look at. So then we looked at the Apocrypha, and we saw that same thing. We looked at the books of the Apocrypha. And then last week, we kind of looked at that, and we looked at the Orthodox editions. Let's just look at that real quick. They have the Apocrypha here, the Ezra Apocalypse, and then some basic notes for it. And we said that these, the current versions we have do have errors in them, but that doesn't mean a whole lot. So for instance, Judith, we said, was a record of an incident that happened when the Assyrians were attacking the 10 tribes, but it happens to mention that Nebuchadnezzar was leading it. Well, Nebuchadnezzar is a king of the Babylonians, and that was like 100 some odd years later. So again, somebody just added some word or mixed up the leaders or something. So we've got all these things too. So pretty interesting. Some of the interesting points. Now I'm Protestant, I'm actually Calvary Chapel. So I would stick with just the 39 books of the Old Testament as the canon. But some of the interesting things about it, some of the Protestants will just totally throw away anything extra biblical. And one of the arguments was, well, it doesn't appear in Hebrew anywhere. And that is a very, very good argument. If it was real, it would have been written by Jews in Hebrew and then translated into Greek. So why would we have the Greek and not the Hebrew? Very good question. But some of these things, it's interesting. For instance, we mentioned that the entire book of Tobit, which is an apocryphal work, is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's 4Q 196 to 200. So what does that mean? It means they were aware of it. It means apparently there really was a Hebrew version. So it's something that we might want to look at again for historical notes. So we've got this kind of thing going on, much like Josephus. No one would put Josephus in the canon. Actually, somebody did, but you really shouldn't. So we looked at that, and pieces of Sirach and other things like that. So last week we finished by looking at the Orthodox editions. And what we were saying is that even though that's the way it's supposed to be, some religious groups put extra books into their Bible canon. And that doesn't mean anything other than the fact that I'm kind of glad they did, because they preserved them that way. So they're not scripture, they're not part of the 39 books, but they're there anyway. And so what we did is we looked at the Anglican Church and then found out that there's the Greek Orthodox, there's many Orthodox churches, but these 9 specifically we looked at. So the Greek, the Syrian, the Georgian, the Assyrian, the Slavic churches, the Egyptian Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox, and then the Ethiopian Orthodox. And then if they had any extra books in their canon that are also mentioned by the Dead Sea Scrolls, the church fathers, or something like that, we would put those in there. So then we said basically all the Orthodox canons have the 39 books of the Old Testament. They're not missing anything. They have the 27 books of the New Testament. They're not missing anything. They have the 13 books of the Roman Catholic Apocrypha with the Ezra Apocalypse. So we looked at these. These are the first and most important. And anything in red we can click on, and there's either another article on it, or in this case, we would be able to go get our translation, the Bible Facts translation of it. So this is one of the, I consider, really important prophetical books that are out, that's outside the canon. So anyway, the interesting part is that the Anglican and the Slavic churches have the entire book. For some reason, the Assyrian, the Georgian, Syrian, and I guess those churches also have it, but thought that chapters 1 and 2 and 15 and 16 were later additions, so they don't have them in their canon. Interesting debate on those type of things. But then we just looked at some of these others. So the Ethiopian canon, along with the Ante-Nicene Fathers and the Dead Sea Scrolls, either have pieces or quote pieces of the Book of Enoch. And we went through some of these others. So like the Syrian and Armenian churches have 3 Corinthians. And I don't have that linked, but we have 3 Corinthians available too, translated. Anyway, we have all of these others. Now, some of these, especially when you get down to some of the things that are in the Ethiopian canon, the Ethiopian canon is the largest. It has some 80 books in its Old Testament. And several of those have never been translated into English. So I don't know if they're worth looking at or not. Eventually, someday, someone will translate it. It's an interesting language. It's not even Amharic, which is their current language, but it's a really ancient form of it called Ge'ez. And most of you know, like, for instance, the Hebrew language currently has 22 consonants and vowel points. English is 20, 25, 26 letters. We used to have a couple of more. But the Ge'ez language, I think, has over 200 letters. So it's a really interesting language. Basically, what they're doing sounds. So there's a B, like a ba, a bay, a boo, a bo, that kind of stuff. So that's how they come up with some 200 and some letters. So anyway, so some of these are definitely not what they're supposed to be. We mentioned like the history of Joseph and Asenath. Gary Stearman was talking about that the other day. And so really interesting history of Joseph and his wife. This one here, Josephus' War from Book 7, is in the Ethiopian canon. It's specifically that part about how the things that happened at the temple right before it was destroyed. So really interesting prophetic miracles and things like that. And then we mentioned Paul's epistle to the Laodiceans is in some of the Wycliffe and Quaker Bibles. And I think I mentioned to you last week, but in addition to some of those over here, there is a Waldensian Bible called the Vodou. And the history behind it is that it was a translation from people who knew the apostles back in the 2nd century BC, or AD rather. And what's interesting about it is that it has the Old Testament, the 39 books, the New Testament, the 27 books. It has no Apocrypha in it. But the one thing it does have is the Laodiceans. So it'd be really interesting to do this. I've never seen one. I don't know if any still exist. But there is a lengthy discussion about it between John Wesley and I think it was Jonathan Edwards. So it's kind of interesting things. So Psalm 151, we all have 150 Psalms in our Bible. And Psalm 151 is in almost all of these, including Dead Sea Scrolls, Nicene Fathers, all of those quoted. So, and then the 12 patriarchs, we made an interesting comment about that the story is kind of the same. Somewhere in the Middle Ages, somebody says that they found Hebrew copies of these things in some caves in Judea somewhere, brought it to the Armenian church. The Armenian church recognized it as being legitimate, translates it into Greek, and puts it in their canon. Well, that's the story, but nobody knows where the original Hebrew copies went. You know, the church using Greek would simply say, don't know, don't care. We have the official, so it's not an important thing. But that's just one of those things that just sounds too convenient. So it's something that you kind of dismiss. But then when we come back to the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1948, people discover a whole lot of Hebrew scrolls in those Judean hills. And pieces or some fragments of them were parts of the 12 patriarchs. When we get to it, the Dead Sea Scroll study, we're going to look at those in depth. We'll have the other lists up to talk about them too. So it's just really interesting that was in the Armenian Bible, Dead Sea Scrolls, and of course, Nicene Fathers. So that's where we kind of left off last week. And so this week, I just put this up today. So we're going into extra biblical books, not books in the canon, but books that the canon itself would recommend. So that's our study for today. And we're going to look at some of these. Let me just pull this up here. So this is basically just a list. And so it'll be there for us to look at. And if I've doubled them or I'm missing one or something like that, just let me know. But we'll just go through some of these. So from the Old Testament, there is a legend about 5 prophets that are called the Lost Five. It's a really interesting legend. We've talked about this in our introduction to Gad and other things like that. But in 1 Corinthians 29:29, it mentions that there is Gad the seer, and we see him all the way through Chronicles and Samuel. He was one of the seers of David. And then Nathan was one of the seers of David and Solomon. And so there are these prophets that actually do things. But in 1 Chronicles 29:29, it mentions the fact that he wrote a book, a prophetical book. And then it also mentions that Nathan wrote a prophetical book. And then it mentions in 2 Chronicles 9 that there's a prophecy book or a book of prophecies and probably history written by Ahijah the Shilonite. There's other Ahijahs rather. And then there's in 2 Corinthians 12, there's Shemiah, and then there's also the prophet Iddo mentioned in 2 Chronicles 13, 12, and 9. So these are the prophets in the time period of Samuel. And so they talk about these in the books of Samuel and Chronicles about Samuel the prophet, his writings. So I'm assuming then we're just talking about what we call 1st and 2nd Samuel, is the writings of Samuel the prophet. And if that's a model, you can see how it's mainly history, but there are some very important prophecies kind of scattered around in there. Anyway, so that's the legend that these guys wrote. Well, we know from scripture they did write books of prophecy. And I remember in different people in seminary saying, well, these guys probably took all of their notes and put them together, and that's how we got Kings and Chronicles. And I'm sure that's true. Somebody wrote Kings and Chronicles. And according to the legends, and they would be the prophets who put them together or overseed them or whatever. But the way this is talking about is that they're specific books, which may or may not be all included in the canon. So come to find out, long story short, there is a group of Jews that believed the prophecies about the Assyrians coming down and taking the 10 tribes captive. This would be around 720 BC. So if you've seen prophecies and you know there are real prophecies in the Bible, and you're living in a country that's going to be decimated in the next 5 or 10 years, and you already see the prophesied person beginning to move this direction, if you're intelligent, you just pick up and move. I mean, God's got nothing against you. You're a worshiper of the Lord, and he's warned you, repent or be annihilated. Your brothers here don't repent, so we pick up and move. And you can follow their wanderings basically through the histories. But they have not even a complete Old Testament like we do, not even the 39 books, because they never knew anything about the some of the minor prophets and some of the others. But they do have Gad, Nathan, Ahijah, Shemaiah, and Iddo. And we're trying to get our hands on those. And officially, we keep being told, no, those don't exist. We don't know what you're talking about. And then I was finally told, no, you cannot have them. So that tells me that there's something there. But 100 to 150 years ago, there was a Jewish guy, again, long story short, that actually translated the book of Gad the Seer into, I believe, Dutch. And since then, we have found a couple of more Hebrew copies, Hebrew fragments going along with it. And it is another amazing prophetical book. We have a few pieces of Nathan, which are very, very interesting too. Have some very, very interesting prophecies in it. One of the things is interesting. A lot of Jews, for instance, today will look at when we talk about the virgin birth, and we quote Isaiah chapter 7. Behold, a virgin will conceive, bear a son, and will call him Emmanuel. A lot of them will say, well, it's the word Alma. It's not the word Bethula. So Alma actually could mean young person. Like they're a virgin, but they're like, they haven't grown up yet. So that kind of stuff. So this is a young girl that gets married. She was a virgin, that kind of thing. So there's this argument on whether there's really a virgin birth or not. And a lot of people have argued, well, Bethula is a young bride. Alma is a virgin. And people would say, no, it's the other way around. So it's an interesting debate among some of the Jews. But the book of Nathan the prophet is really interesting because it prophesies a virgin birth, but it doesn't use Alma or Bethula, no specific word for a virgin. The prophecy basically says that there is going to be a young woman who has never been with a man. However, she holds in her hand her baby boy, and her baby boy is the Lord of the earth to the ends of the earth. So that's an interesting prophecy. So there's a virgin that is never conceived the normal way, but she has her baby boy in her arms. That's a virgin birth. Didn't use Alma, didn't use Bethula, didn't use anything else. It's descriptive. So you can't really argue the language. And so the fact that he's the Lord of the earth to the ends of the earth would have to mean he's either Adam, Lord of the earth, but Adam lost control, or he's Noah, who is the Lord, the king of the entire planet, but he lost control. This person doesn't lose control. And so this person we understand is the Messiah. So the girl is the mother of the Messiah, which apparently is an actual virgin the way we think of it. So anyway, it's just interesting how some of these things, it's the exact same prophecies. And we don't know. Isaiah may have been thinking about this or even quoting him in that sense. But in either way, these kind of things are really interesting if they come out to help with this. When we get to the Dead Sea Scrolls study, we're going to see a lot of little things like that where they don't quote. We quibble about the words, and they will not even use those words, either one. They will describe it to the point that we know what they're talking about. So anyway, I don't have much of anything, just a few hints of what's supposed to be in Ahijah, Shemaiah, and Iddo. So very little that I know about them. But it's an interesting thing. So the biblically endorsed books, we're just looking at what the Old Testament, at this point, the Old Testament, says about books. So in Chronicles, we have the book of Gad, the book of Nathan, the book of Ahijah, the book of Shemaiah, and the book of Iddo. So those are books that are mentioned, but again, not supposed to be in the canon. The books of Samuel are supposed to be in the canon, so pretty interesting. So those are the lost five specifically. And then we also have other prophetic type books. So in 1 Kings 4, it mentions the Proverbs of Solomon, the fact that there's 3,000 of them. And I don't know if that's close to 3,000, exactly 3,000, or if they mean there's over 3,000. However you say that, that's more than the amount of Proverbs we have in Proverbs. So there's some extra ones out there. The Songs of Solomon, there's supposed to be 1,005. And so it's interesting to me, there's actually a Dead Sea Scroll that counts up the number of proverbs and songs that Solomon had, the number of psalms and songs that David wrote, and they are more than what we have in our biblical books of Psalms and Proverbs. I'm sure some of these are in our canon, and obviously some of them are not because there's way too many. But we have a record then from Kings and Chronicles. So if you can see what we're doing, we're not adding to the canon at all. It's supposed to be exactly what it is. But if it says more than this exists, or at least used to exist, if we can find it, we need to look at it. Understanding they could be corrupted, they could be mistranslated. Got to be careful of anything extra biblical. But we need to continue the concepts. In 2 Chronicles 33:19, we have something called the sayings of the seers. And it's interesting to me, the word there is hosai, and it's plural, but basically it can mean seers, or it could theoretically be a person's name. So in some translations, you'll see this as the book of Hosea. And it could be that way, but it's probably the book of the seers. And again, some people have said, well, that's all the prophets. And so the prophets simply wrote 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st Chronicles, 1st, 2nd, these things. And that's possible. It's always possible. But the way that it's worded in 2nd Chronicles 33:19 is that there's a specific words of the sayings of the seers. And so a lot of times you might have a person who is a prophet overseeing like the development of the canon and putting together historical notes here, chronology notes of who's, the king's nephew and who would be possibly the next king, and doing all that stuff. You also might have over here a book of prophecy. And you might mix some of them together if the prophecies end up talking about a certain person or whatever. So anyway, and then we have the vision of Isaiah mentioned in 2nd Chronicles 32:32. My guess is we're talking about the prophecy of Isaiah. So it's just Isaiah. Not necessarily, though. There could have been something else. The basic teaching in the scrolls is that anything that was put in the canon is in there because it has something to do with end time prophecy. So if Isaiah, for instance, wrote a prophecy that some guy's a bad guy, and if he doesn't repent, he's going to get struck by lightning, and he got struck by lightning, and that's all there was, has nothing to do with end time prophecy. The concept in the scrolls is that that would have never been put in the canon. So there could be something like that somewhere else. And that kind of makes sense because in the New Testament, where we're told about the daughters of Philip were prophetesses, Agabus was a prophet. There's one or two prophecies he made about Paul. Don't know if he wrote a book or not, but those kind of things. And there was Quintinus, the church fathers talked about. And that goes back to the argument of, do the gifts cease? And I don't believe they did, because the Pharisees back in the days of Jesus said the gifts stopped. Well, they did for them, because these guys are heretical. They're not even teaching real Jewish theology. The Essenes, of course, were noted to be 100% accurate prophets and healers. And then, of course, if you're a Christian, you believe the New Testament. So there's all sorts of prophets, miracles, and things in the New Testament. So obviously it continued. And then the question is, did they stop with Christians? Well, again, there are cults, and there are just lukewarm churches that probably nothing happens in. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that make stuff up also, but I don't think that they stop. As a matter of fact, there's a couple of church fathers that say that the gifts do not stop until, as Paul said, that which is perfect has come. And then to define that which is perfect as being the rapture of the church, or the second coming, the end of the church age. So it's interesting to see that that was their concept. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. They're not apostles, but if they were back there and knew the disciples of the apostles, it's kind of puts them up a little higher on the commentary scale. So again, and here's an interesting one. In 1 Kings 4:33, it talks about Solomon's botany or biology book, and he's talking about the benefits of like bees and animals and plants and things like that. So it's either some sort of food preparation and or medicine. And basically, in the Eastern way of looking at it, food is medicine. If you eat the proper food, you won't need medicine. If you need medicine, then you're not eating the proper food. They would talk about things like that. And so we know about Hagi, which is the herbal medicine book, and we will get to studying that here pretty quick. So we'll actually have a section in here where we can study herbal medicine and look at things from a Dead Sea Scroll perspective. So what did they recommend we eat or not eat or cook or fasting or, whatever they said? Because according to Josephus and the others, these guys were 100% accurate prophets. They were also people that lived to be about 110 to 120. And that was because of their diet. Not that they ate kosher or didn't eat kosher, because the Pharisees ate kosher, or supposedly. Sadducees, who knows? They didn't really believe in anything. But so the kosher food probably made you live a little longer than the Gentile food, because the Gentile food was pretty messed up. Some Gentile food back in the day. But in addition to food, though, maybe their genetics were better too, but we're exploring that kind of thing. We're actually beginning to figure a few things out. Some of us has begin doing experiments with herbs and things that fit the description. We don't know if it's the same one or not, but are having really good success with some of this stuff. And, so, and again, we're not saying anything about any type of controversy that's been amongst the Christians and doctors in the last couple of years, if you know what I mean. But the whole concept is, if there's ever any kind of a problem, be it them or even you can't get to a doctor. You can't buy whatever because something, somehow you just can't get it where you're at. We need to know at least the basis of like first aid. You need to have a first aid kit in your home just in case, that kind of thing. You need to have a fire extinguisher in your home just in case. I love the fire department. They do a much better job than I do. But if it's going to take them time to get here, I need a fire extinguisher and I need to know how to use it. And so that kind of stuff. And some of the prophecies in the Dead Sea Scrolls that we will eventually get to talk about the fact that, especially in the end times, you need to be somewhat self-sufficient. And they talk about how you need to have a minister in your church that knows the word well, that teaches morality, teaches everything properly. You need to have a prophecy expert, and that may or may not be, your main minister, but at least somebody that you can go to that is not even necessarily a prophet, but a son of the prophets, a student, a serious student of Bible prophecy. And then they also mention you must have a Hagi expert, an herbal medicine person. And that begins to be more and more important as the day approaches. So really interesting. And if you think about it, it makes sense, especially if you were in the tribulation period for whatever reason, and then you got saved and you've got to somehow make it through to the second coming. And whether you get shot or beheaded or not, but something could happen, poisons, you're out trying to hunt for food, accidents happen. You probably need to know how to take care of yourself. So, not that I'm a prepper or anything, but it's interesting. So, we're trying to figure all that out from their perspective. So, the fact that a biology book or a botany book is mentioned is kind of interesting. So, going on in the Old Testament, just unknown. We're not sure what these things are. There's the Book of the Wars of the Lord. There has been a small section of the book called the Book of Wars, may or may not be this one, found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's not much to it, but there's enough that we need to study it. There's the Book of the Covenant and the Book of the Lord. The Book of the Covenant could simply be like Deuteronomy, or it could simply be like the covenant structure of the Essenes, if they were the original one. And so we have like the book we just recently released last year, a fresh English translation of the Damascus document and the community rule. It's that kind of stuff put together. I'm not sure what this is, but it's mentioned. And then law books. We have the Law of Kings. We have a midrash on the Book of Kings, and then a treatise on the Book of Kings mentioned in those places. So we translated what we think is the Law of Kings based on what Samuel said in 1 Samuel 10:25. And basically what that is that, and this helps our understanding. So I have Hebrew roots friends, for instance, that say we're supposed to do the entire law of Moses. Well, that's fine. Make sure you compartmentalize it. You're not a king, right? So you don't go execute somebody without a trial. The king could do that. You're not a king, okay? You don't sit in judgment and hold somebody in your basement locked up until you decide what to do with them, because you're not part of the Sanhedrin, okay? You're not a woman, so you don't give the offering for giving birth, because you don't give birth if you're a man. And so there's these things like that. You're not a priest, right? So you don't do the things associated with sacrificing animals or running the temple rituals. That would be forbidden. So you've got to compartmentalize these, okay? And the book of the Law of Kings is specific, the law that kings of Israel are to do, and their understanding of Gentile law and Hebrew law and how it works together. It's an interesting study. And then historical, this is the Old Testament, probably just history. So, for instance, we have the Acts of Solomon, the Acts of the Kings of Israel. I've got that in there again, so this one needs to be taken out. But we don't know if the Acts of Solomon and the Acts of the Kings of Israel are kings, or maybe chronicles, or maybe pieces of it that were put in later, maybe more detail. Maybe we already have all that. We don't know for sure. There's the Acts of Isaiah, the Amalekite Memorial Book, the Annals of Jehu, the Book of Chronicles mentioned by Nehemiah. That very well could be 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Then there's the Book of Jasher mentioned in Joshua. And again, we've got a link here to it. We have a translation of that. We don't know for sure if everything in it is accurate, if something has been embellished. You never know about that kind of stuff, but it does help explain a lot of things. A lot of the stories in it that seem fantastic are also found in the Talmud and many other places. So since this is supposed to be older, it makes you think this could be legitimate. There's several fake books of Jasher floating around, much like we looked at before. There's the book of Enoch. There's several fake books of Enoch floating around. And it's nice to have the church fathers in this area because they'll tell you what we consider first Enoch is the book of Enoch, and second and third and all these other things were written by cults later. And so that's pretty interesting just to have the church fathers tell you that. Sometimes they'll actually tell you, we know this is fake because we know which cult wrote it. We know the guys behind it. We've excommunicated them or they're in prison or whatever now. And it was somebody's brother and it was over here. And they'll give the whole history sometimes on some of these things. So pretty interesting. That's why we need to pull it all together. The scrolls tell us the theology and what's supposed to happen. The New Testament tells us exactly how it did happen. And then the church fathers continue the story and say, because of everything that happened, this is what we do. And these are legitimate and these are not. So it's really nice to see that kind of thing. And when I say church fathers, I mean ancient church fathers. So just the like first and second century, people that would have been eyewitnesses of the apostles, or at least their parents were eyewitnesses of the apostles way back there in the beginning. So then we have the Book of Laments, Book of the Kings of Judah. That could be kings, Judah and Israel. The Book of Samuel the Seer. I'm sure that's First and Second Samuel, or one of them at least. There's the Chronicles of Jehu, this might be a different Jehu because it's a son of Hanai. There's the Chronicles of King David, the Chronicles of the Kings, Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. They may be the same. Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, Chronicles of David, and the Chronicles of Samuel. So again, we don't know too much about these. The only one in here that we're fairly sure is not part of the canon is the book of Jasher. And then finally, that ends our 40 some in here. But from the New Testament, we have a handful. And so we wanted to look at these. First, in Jude 9, it gives you the story about Moses dying, and the Michael wants to preserve the body. Lucifer wants to take the body for whatever reason. And the writer in Jude is saying, well, this is a perfect example of humility. You know that Lucifer doesn't deserve or need to take what he's trying to take. The body of Moses does not belong to him. But just because you know that this is an error doesn't mean that you're the one supposed to stop in and stop the whole process. Probably, but not necessarily. And so it's a good model of not bringing against yourself a railing accusation. Now, if the Lord had told Michael, for instance, you guard this and make sure nobody touches it. If somebody tries to touch it, shish kebab them. You do whatever it takes, but you protect this. Then Michael would be held accountable and would have done something with Lucifer. So it's all in that situation. We need to understand that too. We know what's right and wrong, like in our society, but unless the Lord tells you to run for office, to start a militia, to do something like that, it may not be part of the Lord's will. You always got to try to figure out the Lord's will. But in this concept that Jude is trying to teach about morality and the understanding of that stuff, he mentions that story. And that story, according to the early church fathers, is in a book called The Ascension of Moses. We have parts of that today, but we don't have the ending part. So the story about what Jude is quoting, we don't have. So I don't know really anything else about it. And then in Jude 14, and also in the book of Jubilees, but it talks about the book of Enoch. And these are quotes by names. I'm not talking about if they loosely quote them, but a quote by a name. So first Enoch is mentioned by name. And I think it's Enoch 1:17 or 19 or something like that. The entire verse is actually quoted by Jude. And interesting thing about this, and again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, the whole concept is that even though Enoch might be the original one and it might be a good one, the original was translated probably multiple times throughout the centuries, then translated into Ge'ez, and then translated into English. And Jubilees and Enoch both, when you compare the fragments of Enoch and Jubilees we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the stories are the same, but the numbers are different. And I've mentioned that before, but the book of Jubilees, for instance, it starts off with creation, and at one point it just keeps getting off and off and off. So the date for a certain event is up to 300 years off. But then all of a sudden it changes and it starts going back the other way. And so from creation to I think it's the death of Jacob, it's within 1 year of Genesis. So no matter what chronology you use, the fact that it gets way off 300 years and then comes back to being pretty much there, somebody's tampered with the text, or on purpose or accidentally, but it's garbled somehow. And we see the same thing in Enoch. There's a couple of numbers. And the Dead Sea Scroll versions, the few that we have that have numbers in them, they match Genesis perfectly. So that's what's really cool about that. So again, that's that whole concept of everything with a grain of salt, but don't throw it away and not study it either. Second Thessalonians mentions that there was a forged letter in the name of Paul to Thessalonica. And we've seen this too, because we're also told in Colossians to read Paul's epistle to Laodicea, which is not in our New Testament canon. We said it's been preserved in a few other places, but or at least we think it is, because the Maturonian canon fragment we talked about a couple weeks ago, one of the early church fathers saying this is what should be in the New Testament and this is why. This is how it happened. This is the guy's name. This is where it was at. Gives us a lot of details. But he mentions that there is a forged version of Laodiceans and Alexandrians, forged in the name of Paul, specifically against the heresy of Marcion. And that helps us. So if you find a Laodiceans, for instance, you can, if you know what Marcion taught, what that particular cult taught, you can look at it and it's either trying to combat those ideas or it's not. So it's something to look at. Either way, there at least was a real one and at least one fake one, for sure. And then with Corinthians, again, we have 3rd Corinthians from the Armenian canon we talked about. And the church fathers talk about 4 separate epistles to Corinth, 2 of which are canonized and 2 are not. And you can see this in the books, because in 1 Corinthians, we have a guy who was fornicating and he refused to repent. So Paul said, kick him out of the church, excommunicate him. Well, apparently they did that, because then in 2 Corinthians, the guy repented and they reinstated him like they should. Well, you have to sin to get kicked out, and then you have to get kicked out to be reinstated. So that tells us that 2 Corinthians is after 1 Corinthians for sure. Well, in 1 Corinthians 5, and that same issue about what to do with this guy, Paul says, I wrote to you earlier in an epistle not to accompany with fornicators. So kick this guy out of your church. Well, that tells us that there's an epistle of Paul to Corinth written before 1 Corinthians. And in 3 Corinthians, with the Armenian version, it doesn't have anything to do with anything about fornication. So that's not the one Paul's talking about. So in order, there should be a 0, a 1, a 2, and the 3rd one. And so to my knowledge, I don't know anything about the 0 Corinthians, but we do have 3rd. So that's pretty interesting. You don't really learn a whole lot more, but there is some interesting insights about Gnosticism coming back in the end times, and that's already happened, so that's not a problem. And then a couple of names of people that were the Gnostic problems in Corinth. And, that means really nothing to us, but it is kind of interesting to see. And then in Hebrews, Paul mentions, and again, not by name, but he mentions the martyrdom of Isaiah. He talks about some people were put in logs and sawed in two. That's in many historical documents about how Isaiah died. So that's the death of the prophet Isaiah. And there's a lot of other things when we get to them. For instance, I was talking with a friend earlier today and saying that in Matthew chapter 11, the disciples of John the Baptist come to Jesus and say, are you he who was to come, or should we look for another? And a lot of times we look at that and say, John the Baptist was doubting after all this time. No, he wasn't doubting. The Essene theology said two comings of one Messiah. The Pharisees are saying, no, there's two separate guys. And Jesus seemed to be doing some things, but he definitely wasn't ushering in a kingdom and killing the Romans or anything like that. So the question, and I would be the same way. I would walk up to Jesus and say, just between you and me, pre-trib rapture, right? Yeah, okay. Can you lose your salvation? The gifts still do function, right? Okay, just checking. That's what I would be doing too, even though I'm absolutely sure in my heart, I would like to go ask just to make sure, and I'm sure that's what he was doing. But the interesting thing about that story is that Jesus says, go tell him that the blind receive their sight, that the poor have the gospel preached to him, that the dead are raised. He mentions, I think, 5 things. And what's interesting is we've always thought that these 5 are like things scattered through the Old Testament, and 4 of them are mentioned in the Old Testament by different prophets in different places, except for the dead being raised. That's not a prophecy about what the Messiah would do in the Old Testament. But what's really interesting is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is something called the Messianic Anthology, and it's just a list of prophecies that some guy had put together from whatever, saying the Messiah will do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's the same set, including the raising the dead. So we understand from the church fathers that John the Baptist ran the school of the prophets and would have been very familiar with that. Just like if I would have a chance to talk to Gary Stearman and Chuck Missler and all these guys and say, pull all of your stuff together and let's make a list. And that becomes the list of the, Calvary Chapel or the Baptist or whatever. And so he's running the school, and Jesus says, go back and tell him 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't have to say yes or no. Just tell him the 5 are fulfilled. Let him decide. And John the Baptist is going to say the 5 are fulfilled. Okay, that takes care of that scroll. So it's interesting to see that because there's all these different things in there. And at one point, Jesus quoted about something, I forget exactly the quote, but he quotes about Abraham doing something. And it doesn't say anything in the Old Testament about Abraham doing that, but Jesus was there. We just say, well, he was there, he knows. But the Pharisees stop and they say, how does he know this? He's not a man of letters. That's what it says in the King James. And basically what they're saying is there's the public canon, all the kids know it. And then there's the other stuff that only the scholars are allowed to study. He's not a Pharisee. He's never been part of our group. So how does he know about that one thing in that one book? And it turns out that's a quote from Jubilees, actually. And so, again, Jesus doesn't say, Enoch said, Jubilees said, Messianic Anthology said, the scrolls said. He just says, this is what happened. You decide. So there are direct quotes like the book of Enoch or Enoch prophesied. And then there's other loose quotes where a prophet or it is written, blah, blah, blah. And you don't know who wrote it. You have to go back and find out. And usually if it's in the Old Testament, you can find it, And there's actually several more of those, but these are the official quotes where we mention something like Enoch or Samuel, Jasher, those kind of things. So this is a good start for us, and I think I had one duplicate in here at least. So these are 40, I think, some books mentioned in the Old Testament and the New Testament as things we would want to study. Again, being careful of. So next week, if we have time, we will go through the Dead Sea Scroll. Probably not endorsed. I might change that, but Dead Sea Scroll books, kind of doing the same thing. First off, what books are actually in the Dead Sea Scrolls? So we've got the 39 books of the Old Testament, which is actually 38 because we found pieces of every single book except for Esther. But I say 39 because we also found a piece of parchment that says there's supposed to be the 24 books, which is our 39. So if we found every one except one, and they're all fragmented anyway, and a list that says it's the same amount of books, then we know Esther was included. We just haven't found a piece of it yet. So we've got the Old Testament, and then we've got the other histories, the chronologies, the other prophecies and stuff from the school of the prophets. We're going to pull all that together when we can. So at this point, I'm going to stop, and we'll go into our chat room and look at questions that we might have. Okay, let's see here. First question is, I've read the Ascension of Isaiah. It is thought that it was possibly, is it thought to possibly be the vision of Isaiah? Or is it possibly the same work as the vision of Isaiah, differently from something else? Yeah, that's something we don't know for sure. We have the fragments that are there that are mentioned. In that case, that's mentioned in the Old Testament that there is a vision of Isaiah, which may or may not even just be either the Ascension or the one of the fragments or something else, or it might be referring to the book of Isaiah itself. We don't know for sure. The only thing we know for sure is that the book of Isaiah in the Bible is 100% accurate prophecy. So, but that's, yeah, I can't really answer that, but good question. Maybe someday we will. I keep hoping. But they find new scrolls all the time. I mean, the last scroll that was found, as far as Dead Sea Scrolls go, was 2021, just a couple of years ago. And of course, that was just a piece of, I think it was Zechariah and maybe Malachi or something. Zephaniah, one of them. Anyway, pretty much word perfect. And it was just like a sentence. So nothing that we can really use, but occasionally things like that come up. When they did Cave 12, that would have been 4 years ago, something like that. They found blank, what they thought was blank paper. It was just badly faded. Now they're realizing there's actually writing on it. So we do have a Cave 12 officially, but none of us know what's actually written on it. So that'll eventually be published. And there's several other things that are going to be scanned, and we'll see what actually happens. Next question is, I know that we have letters written between Paul and Seneca, non-canon to be sure, but of historical value and interest. Are there any other letters to Paul existent, and where would we find them? Well, like I say, they have a few Bibles that have Laodiceans. We are told there's at least one forgery, so I don't know if that is legitimate or not. And it seems very, even if it is legitimate, it seems very cut down. If you compare it to Colossians, for instance. Remember, that's what Paul was saying. I want the Colossians to read Laodiceans, and I want the Laodiceans to read Colossians. So you know that I'm telling everybody the same thing. So there probably is some. Now, the stuff between Paul and Seneca, I don't know for sure. When I did the study on 3 Corinthians, we have 3 Corinthians. Let me bring that up here too. So if we go to our bookstore, here's our 3 Corinthians book from the Armenian canon. But in here, we have, in the introduction, there's, hopefully I can do this. Yeah. There's a section in the front where I talk about Paul and Seneca and something else. And I forget which one's which, but there's 2 separate manuscripts that were put together to become, I think there was a Paul and Thecla too. Anyway, but we talk about some of those manuscripts in here. Okay, they don't let us see the whole thing. So anyway, we have that in here, 3 Corinthians. And then I don't think I have anything else of Paul's from the New Testament, but those are the things that we keep trying to get. So as we get them, if they seem weird, we just, put them aside and let you know at least the versions we have are just weird. Don't worry about them, in our opinion. If they seem really, really good to us, we go ahead and publish them. So we will keep doing that. So anything that we publish is going to be on our bookstore page here. So thank you for that question. Next question, we just have a few in here. The church, okay, question. Church gets a new eternal body. What about the Old Testament saints? Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. And the early Jewish believers. Are there different promises or different believers? There are some differences between the Old Testament and the church and the millennial reign. So there's obviously some differences somehow. And the scrolls even talk about certain things that are different. But Paul tries to make it clear that we're saved by grace through faith. And he quotes Habakkuk for that. So the whole concept that Habakkuk is not talking about sometime in the future, it'll be like this. It's always been like this. And so even the Dead Sea Scrolls will quote Habakkuk and say what it's talking about is you have to have faith in Messiah. So the faith in the Messiah himself is what's actually going to save you. So it's always been the same. So salvation's the same. Most things are the same, but there is some sort of difference in the people between the Old Testament and the New, and the dispensation and a few other things, and the way the Holy Spirit works. And I really don't know the difference. I kind of think I would have to be like one of the apostles, or at least in that time period, to have been a pre-Pentecost believer and then become a Christian. And then I would probably know the difference, could tell the difference, But, being born over here on this side, I don't know for sure. Those are questions that are really hard to understand. So as far as the eternal body goes, I would think it would be the same. If you have eternal life, you get a glorified body and you're changed. So at that point, I think we're all going to be the same. That would be my belief on that. And I would get that based on what Paul talks about in like 1 Corinthians 15 about different types of bodies for everything. And he's saying just like there's a major difference between a plant and an animal and a human, and sun, moon, and stars and things like that, there are major differences between a glorified body and a terrestrial body. But in some sense, all humans are the same and all angels are the same in some ways. So good question. In Exodus 4, why was God going to kill Moses after he just recruited him to go to Egypt, circumcision? Well, part of it was that because he wanted to do the one thing, his wife didn't want him to do that. So it seems like he was going to follow what his wife suggested. And God made sure that he understood, you don't obey anybody else but me. Because if he's going to knuckle under and do what his wife said, what's going to happen when he's in front of a king who at any moment could snap his fingers and have him executed? Is he going to knuckle under then? No, I said circumcise the child, and I said go there, and we have to learn that what I say is what I say. And so I think it was a really good experience for him. And I don't know the specifics on it. There's a lot of speculation on things that might have happened or that kind of stuff. Okay, next one is also kind of disturbing that God already told Moses that he was going to harden Pharaoh's heart right after the start of the whole ordeal. Yeah, that is, and it's very scary to think about that. But God intervenes when He wants to, and He's sovereign, so He can do anything, and He needs people. Half the time, it doesn't matter what you're doing, but sometimes it matters that you do exactly what He wants you to do, or He'll get someone else. I mean, Moses could have said, "I ain't doing this," and would have walked away, I'm sure, because he has free will, and the Lord would have got someone else. But then again, the Lord, knowing the hearts of people, probably picked Moses knowing that he would want to do this. But again, there's always a learning process. We see with Abraham kind of the same way, the whole idea that, you know, um, tell everybody that Sarah's my sister because they might kill me. Okay, think about what you're saying. You're supposed to have a child with her. She's not pregnant yet. You can't get killed. The prophecy. You believe it or not? Then don't worry about it. But that's pretty spooky. I might get killed. So you can see him kind of progressing. And then you get to the type where the time when he says, take your son Isaac and sacrifice him. But the promise is that the seed would come through him. And if I kill him, he's not going to have any kids. So how does that work? But Abraham had progressed in his faith enough to say, I don't get this, but I'm going to obey and not give it much of, I'm sure it grieved him, but he didn't give it a second thought. And it was just a test, you know. And so it's that same thing. We need to go from, and we will as a new believer. I'm not sure about this, but we have to progress, as Paul says, from faith to faith, from circumstance to circumstance, and then eventually get to the place where we're strong in the faith. And that's very, very important. But yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more to the story than we know. I still believe that Lucifer wanted Moses' body because he knows Moses will be one of the two witnesses. That's a definite possibility. There's some reason, and a lot of people would think that maybe it's just as a trophy, but I don't know what Moses looks like. So if Satan was saying, see what I got, I don't know what you got. I've never seen Moses before. So I don't really see it as a trophy per se, at least as far as humans are concerned. But now that would make some sense. So it's a possibility. A lot of people think it's Moses and Elijah, or Enoch and Elijah, or people that come in the spirit and power of Moses and Elijah, but they do those works. And the Mount of Transfiguration, we see Moses and Elijah. At the very least, if he had the body, Moses wasn't glorified, that wouldn't have happened maybe. So there's a lot there. So I'm sure. Did the Israelites that died in the wilderness go to heaven? Ooh, that's a good question. Again, the whole idea of them going to heaven is if they're obedient, if they're saved by faith. And we all commit sins, but it's different when you commit a sin because you want to commit a sin. I want to get drunk. Just leave me alone. I'm going to go get drunk. That's one thing. But to fight actively against God and his kingdom because you have come to dislike him or hate him, that's a totally different situation. So I'm sure some of them were in different camps. I don't think we can actually say blanketly that the entire group did or didn't. But yeah, it's a spooky place to be in. When I read Hebrews 4, it sounds like they didn't make it because of disobedience. Did I understand Hebrews 4 correctly? Yeah, Paul is making that point, but it may or may not be that they died and went to hell. The main thing is that they didn't enter the promised land that they could have. So that at the very least tells us if you get mad at God and walk away and refuse to do what you're told, you could miss out on a lot of blessings. God's will still be done. Somebody will inherit the land, but they messed up on it. Matthew 21:21 says that with faith you can cast a mountain into the sea. Could Revelation 8:8 be the two witnesses casting the mountain to the sea, which then turns to blood? That's an interesting thought. I hadn't really put those together. I think in the sense that means, I doubt it means by my own faith or by whatever kind of faith that I could actually make a mountain like Mount Rushmore disappear. So it's got to be the whole concept of what's coming against you. Mountains in the old manuscripts are empires, things that want to destroy God. And so we can, by the power of the Holy Spirit, push that back. And we're supposed to be pushing it back. That's that whole concept of we know the Antichrist is coming. We know he's going to have a mark of the beast. So any technology that's going that direction is obviously not him yet, but we want to slow that down. We don't want to help usher in the Antichrist. And so that's why people will get mad at us when we say we don't want to take a mark. We may not want to take certain medical things, have certain things on our phone that invade privacy. I'm not doing anything that's illegal. I don't think I'm ever going to do anything that's illegal unless they make something that's a God-given right illegal. Like if I defend myself or I speak my mind, free speech, they decide that's hate speech or something, there could be problems. But we as Christians then would push back on that. Yes, we want to speak the truth and only the truth. But the truth is, Christianity teaches this, Islam teaches this religion teaches that. And you can't just say we're all one big happy family. The manuscripts teach what the manuscripts teach, and anybody that can read can understand it. So we don't want those people to lie and mix things up, because it's really important to us. So that's an interesting question. Thank you. Okay, let's see here. Can you quickly recap, the relationship of the Essenes, the School of the Prophets, and the Zadok priests? And where did Zechariah fall? If you're talking about John the Baptist, oh yeah, between the altar. Well, basically, according to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Zadok priests are the real priests. So you had to be a priest in Israel, you had to be a direct descendant of Levi. And later on, that was shortened to be a direct descendant of Aaron. And then later on, it was shortened again. You had to be a direct descendant of Zadok. Zadok is a descendant of Aaron. Aaron is a descendant of Levi. So it's just shortening the family line. So now all these, people, branches of the family going out, trimming them out. So according to them, they kept the original faith, the original teachings. Basically, people rose up and started doing heretical things. In the first and second century BC, you had fake Zadok priests called Zadokis or Sadducees that tried to come on board, take over, run the real priests out, and actually started killing them. And so there was prophecies in Isaiah and other places about what they would do. And their basic history says that they picked up, the ones that survived, pick up what they had from the prophecies, went to Egypt, built a temple there, waited until the Romans would come in to control everything. And Roman law is, I don't care what you believe, if you worship rocks, you don't kill another person. You pick up something and start to kill him, I shoot you with a bow and arrow or whatever. So nobody's going to be killing anybody. So when the Roman law viciously came in like that and fixed that problem, they moved back into Israel, into Qumran, and they said that someone from their order would be the one to usher in the Messiah, and that was John the Baptist. And they carried with them the temple library, so the Old Testament public Bible, plus the other stuff, the genealogies, the histories, and they talk a lot about the different history books they had, and the other prophecy books. And apparently they're 100% accurate in their prophecies. Their commentary on Zechariah is amazing. You'll never read Zechariah too, but Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Zechariah, Malachi. You'll never read those again the same way. Nahum, I always looked at Nahum and thought, it's Nahum, it's the Syrians, they're all dead. I mean, there's nothing there. There's something there. So it's amazing to see that. So the school of the prophets then continued this through Elijah, through the Zadok priests, all the way down, and then became basically Christians. So you've got Agabus. It doesn't say school of the prophets, but Agabus was running the prophetic group up there, and he and a group of prophets came down from Antioch and worked with Paul. And then you've got Menachem mentioned in Acts, I think 27 or 23. He was one of the old prophets in the Essene order, gave special prophecies and anointed Paul, according to the book of Acts. So there's a whole lot of stuff like that. Church fathers give you a lot of this is what happened after. Kind of like that guy that always on the radio used to say that's the rest of the story. Can't think of his name. Paul Harvey. Yeah. But the church fathers would always give the rest of the story. And it's really interesting to compare all that all together. So the Zadok priests are the real priests, and is seen as either a Zadok priest or a just normal person that follows the teachings of the Essene or the Zadok priests. So like Paul, for instance, was a Benjamite. He could have never been a priest. He's not of the Levite clan, but he was a Pharisee. So he chose to follow the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the Zadok priests, the Essenes. So the Zadok priests proper are the real priests. Essenes are anybody that believes that order. So maybe you're not a Baptist minister, So you can't go baptize people, marry people. You can't do certain things. You're not one of them, but you're Baptist in belief and you go to a Baptist church, that kind of thing. As far as Zechariah falling, I'm not sure exactly who that is. He's talking about Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, that they slew between the altar and the place. So I don't know if that's John the Baptist's dad or what, but it's I'm sure a church father has the answer to that somewhere. Could the first seal, Revelation 6, the four horsemen, happen before the rapture and the tribulation, or do you think they're part of the tribulation? I think they're part of the tribulation, and my reasoning is that you've got chapters 1, 2, and 3 are a perfect picture of the church age. And then chapters 4 and 5 are kind of an introduction to the tribulation period. And I say that because you've got the 24 elders. The 24 elders say, we are the redeemed, those redeemed of the Lord. And so if the rapture is to happen pre-trib, that's about the time it would happen. A lot of people connect it with Revelation 4:1, that come up hither. Whether you do or not, right after that, they're up there. And they are the 24 elders. 24 means something specific, but they're the elders. They're the redeemed of the Lord. We have the same image and information in the book of Gad, so that helps us to understand that too. So I see it all that way. So then the Lord decides to do something. He opens the seals, begins the judgment, the cleansing of the earth. And so that would be the seven-year tribulation period. I could be wrong on that, but that's kind of how I see it. Getting more questions as we go. That's good. Would it be rational to think that the prophecies in First Enoch are actually Enoch's, and stuff like the Book of Watchers and the luminaries were added later? It's possible. The book of the luminaries is basically calendar stuff. And again, what we're doing is you're reading the English version that came from the Ethiopian Ge'ez, which came from the Hebrew. And the Hebrew fragments we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls are, the stories are the same. We don't have much of it though. And the numbers are different. So the numbers in the Dead Sea Scrolls match Genesis. The numbers in Jubilees and the Ethiopic Enoch do not. That was a big problem for figuring out the calendar and the leap week system, because the way it reads in the Ethiopic, it just doesn't make sense. It just, if you're not supposed to go this way, but we go that way, I don't get it. But then you find that same passage in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's just different enough that it's, oh, okay, I get it. This is this, and this is something else. So yeah, it seems like it. It's always possible things could be added. We have our copy of the Book of Enoch, this one here. And in there, what I did was anything that seemed like it might be a Gnostic insert or something that's fake, I went ahead and italicized it. So for instance, there's one place where you're going along the story and it kind of stops and talks about creation again. And then it just picks up with the same story and goes on. But that version of creation, there's nothing really wrong with it, but it sounds Gnostic. Like the sky and the water before the earth came, one was masculine, one was feminine. It just sounds weird. And that could be just because of the translation stuff, or it could be a Gnostic insert. In either case, it doesn't really tell us anything new. So that's what we tried to do with this. But there's some amazing prophecies in the back of the book that do fit for our time period. So I think it's really important for us. I would love to see an actual Aramaic or Hebrew version of the whole thing. It's liable to completely explain itself. But yeah, it's possible. I definitely wouldn't say that the whole thing is divinely inspired. The whole thing is absolutely perfect, because it's obviously not, at least the number part. So yeah, it needs to be studied very carefully like that. $20 donation. Thank you very much. Every little bit helps. We really appreciate that. Super chat, $10. Thank you very much. Again, that really does help. Are there parenthetical chapters in Revelation? If so, which ones? I think so. I think that the middle parts, like chapter 12, 13, it seems like rather than it all being perfectly chronological, we're going chronologically, which I read it that way, and I could be wrong. But you get to chapter 12, and you are talking about something that's right there in the middle of the tribulation period, I think, or somewhere toward the middle. But I think it stops and says, "This is this person, and this is how it happened way back when this happened, and it's going to be like this, but this is what it looks like now." And then it goes on if it's an explanatory type thing. So, for instance, the angels that travel or that came with the tail of the serpent. A lot of us think that that was the fall way back when. It talks about the woman in the sun and giving birth, and that could be the Messiah, or it could be the rapture. In either case, those two events have already occurred. But in either case, they're saying, well, the person that was raptured, the person that was the Messiah, came from this woman. So this woman is obviously Israel, and so that it's explaining the symbolism. So yeah, I think there are parenthetical chapters. I actually have a chart that I did, and I'll have to put it up in our new thing, but it's Revelation with all the extra chapters and how they go together. So I think that will be pretty good. I'll have to do that soon. But thank you. That's a good question. Did the 1611 King James Bible remove some of the lost books? No, that's the whole concept. We have the Old Testament the way it should be, and the New Testament the way it should be. And the extra books are probably good for history, maybe even have a real prophecy or two in them, but are not part of the canon. The idea is that, if I told you you had to read a library of 1,000 books, then you would know enough to make a decision for Christ and get saved. You would say, well, I'm just lost then. I mean, there's just no way I'm going to be able to read 10,000 books and get anything out of them. So the public canon is just enough for you to understand everything. And then there's other history books if you're interested in history, but you don't need to be, because like Peter says, this is written for your learning, and everything pertaining to a life in godliness is contained in it. I would even say just contained in the New Testament, but you need to know the Old Testament, some of it anyway, to know who we're talking about and understand the concepts. So yeah, there are no removed Bibles in that sense. Now, there's always been people that will stick other books in their canon, either simply to preserve it, or maybe they were cults and they put weird things in there. We talked about the Ascension of Isaiah, and there's a Isaiah fragment, part of that work, and it's interesting to look at. It was produced by a cult back in the early days. What they did is they took the real history of what the prophet Isaiah did and how he died. And that's corroborated everywhere. So that part's real. And then they took a prophecy from a church father who was named Isaiah, and that's real. It's about end time stuff. That's why it's kind of important for us to read. But then they took these two pieces, and in between the two, they put their wacky, false Gnostic doctrine. And you can tell by looking at it, that's history, that's nonsense. Ooh, this is legit. But it's all together in one work. And so you'll see cults do things like that. So they can do that with a manuscript. They can do that by putting a book in their Bible, a cultic Bible. We've got some 38, I think, Bibles put out by cults. And then you've got just bad translations out there too, and then some really good ones. So there's no lost books proper. I think the church is special because we have faith without seeing. The apostles saw the miracles, spoke directly to Jesus. Tribulation seats will see the rapture. So, yeah, that's definitely one difference. A lot of times we walk by faith. Sometimes you'll see miracles, you'll see healings. A lot of times we don't. So that is a very good. There's several things where we're different from them. The only things we can say for sure is we're saved exactly the same way. They were never saved by works. They were all saved by faith. They may be cut off from their tribe if they don't follow the law, but their salvation is based on faith in Messiah. And Paul tried to explain that. He didn't mean that it's not possible that the blood of bulls and goats can't save you anymore. It's changed. He said it never worked that way. These are simply rituals we do that point to the Messiah, and salvation is the same. So salvation's always the same. A lot of other things are the same, but there are a lot of things that are different. So I think about this all the time, and I don't know I'd ever figure out exactly all the pieces, but it is interesting to think about. And it's kind of humbling. Just know that the Lord loves you and you love the Lord and you're trying your best. And even though it's not perfect and you mess up sometimes, your best is what he calls the righteousness of faith. You're trying your best. And that's what we want from a son or a daughter. Not perfection, but love and trying your best. Do you think this, the asteroid, yeah, is something worth paying attention to mid-tribulation appearance? Well, we know there's going to be wormwood somewhere in the middle of the tribulation period. One of the asteroids may be a lot of times they talk about Apophis, and then they talk about one other one. Apophis comes around every so often. Actually, a lot of them do. Sometimes they're hundreds of years before they come around again, but others come around every 5 or 10 or 7 years or so. So I doubt this coming up one is going to be Apophis. I mean, it could be, but I don't see the tribulation and rapture and that kind of stuff happening in the next couple of years. Hopefully it will. Hopefully I'm completely wrong on that. But just by looking at all the prophecies, I'm kind of thinking it's off a little ways. But that doesn't mean that it can't be Apophis, couldn't be wormwood, because if it doesn't happen in 25, it could happen in 32 or in 39. It's like I think it's every 7 years, every so many years. So it's worth paying attention to, I think, not just that one, but any kind of an asteroid that might hit the Earth. And if it comes around especially if it's every 5 or 10 years or something like that, one of those is wormwood, I would assume. So yeah, it would be worth looking at for sure. Just don't take too much stock into it, because if it does happen, for instance, the middle of the tribulation can't be 25 anyway, because we're only 2 years off. So that means the rapture would have happened. We'd already be in the tribulation period. So it can't be that one, but it could be, the next one up. Or if it's a different asteroid that doesn't come in 25 or 32, but something at like 28 or something. So we'll see what happens. Something definitely does. Okay, Super Chat. Thank you very, very much. We appreciate your questions, appreciate your watching and those kind of things. And last question here. Could we get a list of the Bibles by cults? Yes. I don't think I have that up, but I can do that. We wrote a book a ways back, this one here called The Ancient Word of God. And we look at some 200 Bibles, most of which are pretty decent. There's the ones done by cults, and then there's the ones that are very, very bad translations. And then the rest of them are actually pretty good. But then what we did is we looked at it and saw that the received text is the one that has all of the text with it. So a lot of times you'll pick up a Bible, it's a good translation, but you'll notice it's missing a verse. You'll be reading verse 24, 25, and then you'll get 28. You'll be like, wait a minute, where's 27 at? The whole verse is gone. And they'll say that that's not in the oldest manuscripts. And they're not lying to you. It's not in the oldest Bible manuscripts or full Bibles, which are 4th century, like 350 or so. But some of the church fathers in their sermons will quote some of these verses. And the sermons are 150 to 200 years before our oldest Bibles. And the point is, whether they be right or wrong, or they misunderstand the Bible or whatever, you can't quote something that hasn't been written yet. So if they're missing that, if they took that verse out because it doesn't appear in like Vaticanus or Sinaiticus, but then there's a church father that quotes it 100 years or so before, then obviously the Vaticanus is a like a practice copy or something, and they forgot to put that verse in. So, and we have the church fathers talking about a lot of the cults in the 1st and 2nd century were producing Bibles without certain verses because they didn't like certain doctrines. And that was happening quite frequently. So we should be thinking of using the received text, the full text. And then if you think of a verse as fake or something, fine. We can debate on that. But we can't debate on it if we can't see it. And so that's the whole thing. So in this case, the bottom line is we looked at certain prophecies and certain church father quotes and went through and found all the Bibles that have those verses in them. And that boils down to a TR type Bible. And there's, I think at the time there were 12 or maybe 13 Bibles that had the full text in them. The other Bibles are just as good as far as like salvation. It talks about how to get saved hundreds of times, so it's fine. But if we're missing a little piece of one verse, and that happens to be describing a prophecy, it might be just the piece we need to understand the prophecy. So it's the reason why we dig in all these other manuscripts too. But yeah, that should be in here, and I'll see if I can find that and just kind of put that on the website somewhere. So, okay, that should be everything for today. It's almost 8:30, so I'll go ahead and say goodnight. So this is our books based on the Bible. And again, what we did is we went to our new site. Where's my button here? This one. And let me exit out of this. So in here, we get to the Bible Facts Network, which is this. And in here, we have under courses, Canons of Scripture, and that's what we're looking at here. So we've looked at the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Apocrypha, other books in the Orthodox canons, some of them that they have, just to have a list. We may not like any of them, but just to have a complete list. And then we've looked at the Biblically Endorsed Books. And then next week, we want to look at the books, the actual books that we have at least a piece of in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then if there's any books that they mention that we should have that maybe we didn't find in the Dead Sea Scrolls but are mentioned. So just pulling together these things. And eventually we'll have dubious books, but eventually we'll have books we know are fake. So like the Gnostic works and other things like that. So this will be a good, and we're doing this just to set the stage so we know that this stuff is junk. This stuff is God's, canon. And this stuff is probably legit, or at least it probably used to be, if we could find the original translations and try to pull them together. Some of the prophecies in the Dead Sea Scrolls are absolutely amazing. And we need to start with Daniel, make sure we understand that really well, and spread out to Enoch and Noah and some of the other things. And then look at how Jesus quotes some of the stuff in the New Testament, pull them together. It'll be really interesting. So we'll go ahead and stop there for tonight. Thank you guys, and we'll see you next week.